This is a big part of the story of the South Side as well as Amsterdam, the bridge. And one of the points I make when I talk about South Side or Jackson is when the first bridge went in 1821. They really started trying to build it in 1817, but they finally got it done in 1821. It lasted about a year, and then it was washed away. Common thing in Amsterdam history. In fact, I believe it's on our calendar now. Why am I drawing a blank? March 27th was traditionally called Bridge Day in Amsterdam, because in 1913, the bridge that went up in 1876 went down, and they started to put up a new one, and then that one went down on the same exact day, 1 year later. So if you were living back then in Amsterdam, you know, superstitious, you did not walk on the bridge on that day. They finally put up, they said, that's it, no more temporary, tried to repair the spans, we're going to build a whole new bridge. That was the bridge that went up in 1916 and stayed up until this bridge was built, and then this one came down. It's a great view of Amsterdam from the south side, but also if you look close, you see that little culvert over there? That's where the North Chuctanunda comes out. And that was built back in about 1867, 68. It actually runs all the way up under Main Street. And there's a classic story of a woman calling the police department when she was working in the building that's now the International Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, and very upset, complaining that the basement was flooded. And the police had to tell her, you don't have a basement. Your building is built over the Chuctanunda. She didn't know. But we have pictures of that brick and stone culvert going in at the same time the Chuctanunda building was going up, where the old Globe Academy had been, where the old Globe Tavern had been. It was also the first home of the Amsterdam Academy. I don't think you can see it from here, but it's the one on the corner of Chuctanunda Street and East Main Street, a very ornate, elaborate building with the fancy eyebrows. Now this building here, very fascinating also. Of course, most of it's gone, and the rest of it will be gone soon too. This was called the Carbonelli block, and this building went up in 1912. It was bought by an Italian immigrant, and his granddaughter, great-granddaughter, tells her story in the tour booklet. Palma Testa, she sent us a wonderful letter with pictures from when she grew up here. Those little buildings you see to the front as we passed and we walked down here, that was where her grandfather first bought in to the property, and it was a grocery store, a shoe repair store, your typical little small town stores. But then he erected this building in 1912, and it became one of the swinging, outstanding points of nightlife on the south side. You could dance, you could fine dining, there were stores here. Notice the cast iron columns. Hopefully we'll get a couple of those before the building's torn down. So this would have been quite the place to come, you know, buy your 5-cent cigar, have a nice dinner, maybe take your wife or your girlfriend dancing with a splendid view of the bridge and the river. At Chalmers...
Just 1 minute.
Yeah. Jackie.
The church fairs were held on here on the 3rd floor, and here's the huge article 1925, the Mount Carmel Fair that was held up here. There's at least 100 Italian names listed helping out here. Okay.
Oh, now we're gonna free range here a bit back and forth, Jackie and I, and of course any of you want to put in a comment. But a lot of people when they think of Amsterdam, what they think about is the diversity over the years, all the different populations, Polish, Ukrainian, Spanish, you name it. The big first diversity in Amsterdam, if you're not counting the English and the Dutch and some German, Scots-Irish over there, the first real immigrant population is over here, and it's Italian and it's Irish. Irish first, then Italian. And the reason is the Erie Canal. The Irish came to dig out the canal, and the earliest Italians came to line it with stone.
But a lot of Germans that were living up on the other end of the county decided to invest down there, and we have a lot of German names in the very early 1900s.
And that's part of the story too, and we'll talk about that as we move down Bridge Street, and also on the Erie Canal West Shore Railroad tour later on today, is that when the canal comes through here, everybody knows it's coming. I mean, they start building the canal in 1817. It isn't open until 1825. This portion gets open in about 1822. So there's actually canal traffic through here before the canal's even finished, all the way through. But people knew it was coming. So they did the smart thing. They started to buy land here. And our land records here in Fort Jackson are very good. We can trace it all the way back to Sir William Johnson, who wasn't even Sir William Johnson, and just William Johnson, managing it for his uncle, Admiral Peter Warren. And it was called Warren's Bush, which was basically all of the north part of the town of Florida, and all the way down for a succession of owners. But what people are doing is they know the canal's coming, so it's a sort of orderly fashion to the way Fort Jackson grows up along the canal. Everybody knows the canal's coming, so you know we're going to jockey for space, but it kind of sets the pattern to how the village will develop. When the railroad comes through in 1880, it does quite the opposite. It's actually, to my way of looking at it, it is the earliest arterial urban renewal destruction of the city. What happens on the other side in the 1960s and 70s happens first here in the 1880s. And when we walk down and you see that wide expanse that kind of runs down from La Cucina all the way down, that's the old rail bed. And it came through and it took out a lot of the village grid and some of the older houses and structures that were here from the canal. Anyway, this was Chalmers. Chalmers was a manufacturer of underwear. In fact, very, for the time, sophisticated underwear. The first building, that was the low brick building that you used to see here, that was started in 1912, finished 1913. The large one was finished in 1916. And that was a very interesting building. It's what's called an American Daylight Factory. If you want to see an example of what an American Daylight Factory is, it's that big thing sitting on the hill, the concrete with the wide windows. It's very interesting. That design really encouraged the Europeans like Courvoisier and Mies van der Rohe, the great architects of the modernist period. And what they did is, maybe we should move back to the bus and get our way here. They saw those designs and thought, this is perfect, you know, structure and purpose, style are all one. And that, they created this modern school of architecture, which then comes back to the United States, because we're broad and European, and that's why we have schools and churches and commercial buildings that all look like factories. Because they fell in love with this factory design, the American Daylight Factory. It's called that because of the large windows let in a lot of light. Right? Now Chalmers made two very interesting products. The first is called Pedestrian, which is advertised with a big sign down on Times Square in New York City. Amsterdamians used to love to point it out whenever they went down to the city. I'm from there. And Pedestrian was a lightweight material invented by a local knitter. The other thing that made product line was in those days, underwear was what they called a union suit, which was a one piece with a little flap in the back. They designed one of the first two-piece underwear. The union suit now came in the top and the bottom. It wasn't a union suit anymore. So that they made their money doing that. They were quite successful for a number of years. But then the factory, after World War II, the government contracts that had helped us through the war weren't here anymore. They started to go down on their income. A series of other companies come in. By the 1980s, the building's pretty much derelict. And then you probably know the rest of the story.
Bridge, a pedestrian bridge. I can see where you can access it from this side. How do you access it from the other side?
That's a $64,000 question. There is supposed to be, when it lands on the north side, there's supposed to eventually be a pedestrian path that'll connect it to Riverlink, and then someday later to Guy Park Manor. However, getting it over onto Main Street is going to be a whole other project, a whole other pile of money that's not factored into the pedestrian bridge that they're designing now. So it will not connect to Main Street, at least to the way it's originally constructed. So, you know, some people have asked, why do it? Now, what I want you to imagine is if you were standing right here, say in 1847, which is when we know that this land was first purchased by the Sweet family, and we believe that's also the year this building was built, although the earliest map reference is 1852. You were standing here looking at the building, you would be dog paddling, because you would be standing right in the middle of a basin of water, a huge basin. Over in front of this building would be the Erie Canal, running straight back in that direction. On this side of the building, all the way down and through Veterans, the South Side Veterans Memorial Park, almost all the way to Mineville Street, would be a huge turn-in basin. And that's how Port Jackson gets its name, because it's the only place, if you're going towards Schenectady or coming from Schenectady on the canal, that you can turn in and get repairs, supplies, maintenance, take a break, whatever you have to do until you hit Schenectady. And a lot of people don't want to do that because after Schenectady, the canal takes 20 steps down to get to Albany. In fact, that's the reason why the railroad first gets developed. One of the first railroads in the country is Albany to Schenectady to try to get around that 20 locks. Anyway, this building originally came out, when you see the brick, there was a wooden extension that came out, set on two poles, which were at the inner end here. These windows have been added in 1950. This is where you would have stopped to get anything from rum, needles, guns, whatever you needed to live on, travel on, a canal boat, or on your way west. It's also a very excellent example of cut limestone work. There are several buildings like this in Amsterdam that go back this far and reflect that great tradition. If you look, the thin lines between the stones, it's really quite expertly done. This is the only brick side. The rest of it is all stone. This is the repair when they took off the second and third story wooden extension. You can see the loading doors on top, and you can see in the bricks up top where they would have had the poles come out so you could pull things up by pulling it. This is the original canal level. Now, the ground in the day of the canal was this level. When they filled in the canal, they filled it higher than it was. So that's why this wouldn't have been here in canal days. All would have been a three-story structure. With that being the ground floor. That's why some people sometimes have made a mistake. They look at this and they think, oh, you drove the boat into the basement. It's just that when the canal got filled in, they brought it up to a higher level. And actually on the other side is So, any questions on the canal store? It is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's privately owned now. I don't think it's the oldest building in Port Jackson for two reasons. One, over where Altier's is now. That we have every reason to think that that end of the building is older probably than this building. That was originally called Warnick's, and then it was Van Antwerp's, somebody else, Vandermeer, all sorts of different owners. It was a warehouse and store for the canal.
You need a biscuit.
Huh?
You need a biscuit.
How do you need a biscuit sign on it too? Huh? But I think that that portion of the building and the other end may be older than this, and then the area between the two that was filled in is different. In fact, if we walk over to the park, and I'd like to show you the park, you can see on the side of this some of the chutes where they used to load the grain.
When did you say this?
Somewhere between 1847 and 1852. We think it's closer to 1847. Oh, one other thing, very interesting. In the tour booklet, the two women who wrote the story about the canal store, They're actually, and I might misplace a great here, they are the great granddaughters of Waterman Sweet, who bought this land and put up the store, and they still operate what the family later changed to be instead of the Sweet Canal store. They opened up the Sweet Ice Company on the north side, and those two women still operate the Sweet Ice Company, but it's now an upscale boutique on Division Street instead of an ice company.
This is the owner now.
Oh,
Niles owns this building.
would you like to add anything about it?
Well, I'm eventually going to open it up to the public and
Wonderful.
have the antique shop in here.
Oh, neat.
The upstairs is beautiful. It's all post and beam. It's just very nice.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned the post and beam, very interesting thing. It's noted in the historical register. You see two kinds of beams in there. One is what they call a reciprocal saw, and the other one is you can actually see the hand saw on the beams. It's fascinating.
And it's got the pegs in it. The pegs
Yeah.
are probably almost 18 inches to 2 feet long that hold the beams together. So
And where would
it's
you
very
have
nice.
parking? Would you have parking?
Well, the lot goes in the back there also, so it will. But there's a canal bed I want to unearth, and you'll be able to drive right down in and see it. It's just like all limestone with the Scary Crossing. So that's eventually, that's the long-term goal.
If you go down where the canal was here, past the store, down about where Dave's Landscaping is, that was a very interesting structure too, because that was a dry dock. Okay, you would pull into this basin to buy what you needed or offload what you needed, but if you really had to get the canal boat out of the water and have it repaired, you went to the dry dock, which is down where, and there's probably a lot of good stones down in that area too. There were basically three kinds of canal boats. The one was called a packet, which was a passenger boat. Another one was called a liner, and then they got a freighter, which was bulk. And just about the time this place is growing up for the canal, the railroad comes in across on the other side. And eventually, in 1915, the canal is drained, and the canal is moved into the river, because at that point technology had improved. You have to understand that Mohawk in colonial days was a much more difficult river than it is now. It was lower. It had, especially when the two Chuctanundas came in, there were a lot of obstructions in the river, and that caused a lot of strange currents. So it was very hard to get up, not as hard to go down, but very hard to get up the Mohawk River. However, it's the only water level approach through the Appalachians to the west, from all the way from Maine down to Georgia. So they tried, they'd bring up bateaus, they'd pole them up the river, but it didn't always work so well. So then they tried to build some reliable roads, because they knew they could never fix the river, not in those days. So the first road comes from Schenectady right through here out to Fort Hunter, which is called the end of the Christian settlements. It's the frontier. After that, it's Indian country. So, as I said to some of you earlier, that's why you see this dance between the south side and the north side, between Vetersburg and Stillwellville, between Amsterdam and Port Jackson. Who's going to be the planet and who's going to be the moon? When the first road goes out to Fort Hunter, it's the south side where the action is. By about 1800, the state is now improving what's going to be called the Mohawk Turnpike. And William Johnson has moved from being under his uncle's operation here on the south side across to establish his own future at Old Fort Johnson, Johnson Hall, and so on. So now the action's on the north side. But then the canal comes through here. So the action's on the south side. And that's why, really, when that bridge first went in 1821, it was not so much to connect the south side to the north side, it was to connect the north side to the south side. Then after the canal comes in, the railroad comes in. Now the traffic's back on the north side. So it's this constant dance. And if things had gone a little differently, instead of Port Jackson being annexed by the city of Amsterdam, it might have been that Amsterdam was annexed by the city of Port Jackson. Just for a few different things in technology. Did you want to add anything more about the Sweet Canal story?
It was nice growing up with a lot of other people here. I'd grown up here on the south side also. We had all the coal yards that were here, and the trains used to drop off all the goods. The Agway was over here and different places. But we had everything we needed. Barber shops, a liquor store, taverns, grocery stores. We had probably 5, you know, and it's it was pretty nice growing 8, you know, and it's we had Lolly's ice cream
Originally,
store
this
and everything.
place was called At the Ford, or At the Ferry later on. And the ferry was back down where the bridge was. And the Ford was down where those 2 islands kind of line up in the Mohawk. And there weren't that many houses, but if you look back on the old military maps from the French and Indian Wars, you can see a few of them. I can see 3 or 4 right through the region. And one of them's a tavern. And then when the village starts to grow up, it's a big thing for people. The hotels and taverns. There were several of large ones on the other side of the canal.
My grandson, Theodore Califano,
Yeah.
told me that we don't usually call an Italian Theodore. His grandfather had a tavern before Prohibition days, and then it was Califano's Market. But in the tavern days, Teddy Roosevelt came by and put his initials on the bar for them. And so his dad was called Theodore, and he's called Theodore.
And we're going to go see some of his handiwork in a minute when we walk across the street. But yeah, a lot of taverns, a lot of hotels, 2 churches,
A bakery.
a real going concern. And I'm not just talking about, 1930s, 40s, 50s. I'm talking way back into the 1850s and the like. Remember that both St. Mary's and St. Anne's, 2 of the largest churches on the north side, start here on the south side. Originally, it's St. Anne's, which had been down at Fort Hunter, and then the church got destroyed when the canal went through, or was enlarged actually. And then, so the St. Anne's Parish builds a church here on the south side on Center Street, which they stay in until about 1839. It's in the tour booklet. And then when they decide they're going to build a new thing across the church you see now, the big Gothic church on Division Street on the north side, they sell it to a newly formed Roman Catholic church, St. Mary's, which then eventually will move over to its church in 1875. What?
69.
69, okay. But the church, wasn't the church not finished? Oh yeah, well, it's interesting also, I talked to some of you about this before. Jackie's making a great point. If you want to, and I don't want to overemphasize this south side, north side stuff, because there's so many connections too. And one of the ways you see that is you walk through Green Hill and you see all the south side names. And a lot of famous north side names start out on the south side. For example, right. Yeah, Livermore, the tavern owner. And I mentioned when we went down on the road, we looked at the McCleary house. McCleary comes here in the 1820s and opens a grocery, probably had a tavern going to. And he ends up buying up a lot of land, and eventually his descendant ends up buying the Reporter from another guy who comes over here earlier, Klein. So there's a lot of family names that get famous on the other side because they make their money here either in business or by buying the land that's now going way up in price because of the canal, and then opening up businesses on the other side. As I was saying earlier, if you were standing here back in the 1850s, before 1915 actually, you would have been standing in the wall. This is the South Side or 5th Ward Veterans Memorial Park. The names on the plaques that are vertical are the servicemen who served from the war during the Second World War. Korean and Vietnam veterans are honored in a separate plaque. It's one of the more beautiful parks in Amsterdam. I always like coming down, and it's well kept up by the people who helped create it. Work started raising the money for the Ward Memorial, and back in those days there were 8 wards right after World War II. So you can actually see 8 ward memorials around town. This started in 1946, and I believe it was dedicated in 1957. The flags you see are the different services, and the POW flag. The 2 cannons here are what are called 75mm pack cannons. They're meant to be taken apart, so you can either carry them on the backs of mules or drop them by parachute. They're a circa World War II weapon that served all the way through into Vietnam, and now commonly used for firing salutes, rendering honors at funerals or on other occasions. The stone and plaque that's located on the left for the main monument is dedicated to Chief Torpedoman Donato Pacico, who also is Pacico Square, the intersection here of Bridge Street, Florida, right below the armory, is also named for him. He was a young sailor in the United States Navy in 1939 when the submarine he was on, the USS Squareless, sank suddenly. It was flooded over Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And it's very interesting because just a week before, a British submarine, similar, had sunk to a lesser depth in Liverpool, but none of them could get out alive. Because we had just invented a new technology for going down with a kind of diving bell, an escape chamber, to rescue the submariners and bring them back up. And Pacico was one of the last people left on the submarine. He is commanding officer, a couple of other sailors. They were the last ones in the last compartment. About half the crew had already died. Half those survivors had, all but a handful of survivors had been rescued. When they brought the bell up, it stuck. And they had to lower it down, and then they'd sent down a diver, try to correct it, didn't work, sent another diver, didn't work. Then they tried to raise it up again, didn't work. So what was supposed to be a few minutes ride to the surface in a pressurized container ended up being like another 4 or 6 hours at the same depth. What they didn't know in the chamber was the cables had snapped, and there was only one cable left to pull the diving bell up with about a pencil's worth of steel left. In fact, it was so, they could not put a new cable on it. So what finally happened is the officer in charge of the operation takes the cable that's damaged off the mechanical hoist, and they tell the guys in the bell to start adding a little air, bringing up a little buoyancy, and they pull it up by hand over the side of the ship because they need to feel, is this thing going to separate? And there's one pencil's thickness of steel between these guys and death, because once that cable snaps and they go to the bottom, you'll never be able to get them back in time before they run out of oxygen and the current gets to them. So finally they pull the cable up over the side and immediately throw a clamp on it and get it up. And Pacico goes on, he serves in the Navy for a number of years, he serves in submarines in World War II, decorated, he wins the Bronze Star, Combat Patrol insignia for submariners, and actually marries a girl from Amsterdam. The story about the girl he marries and all that is in yesterday's paper. The story about the submarine rescue is in the tour book. Anyway, any other questions about the park, comments? We still have a few more things to see before we go back. All right, let's get back on the bus. Over to Chuctanunda. There's a monument down by the bottom of the bridge, and again, we don't have time to do everything, where the Albany and Tryon County militias under General Van Rensselaer paused there to march out to try to defeat the British who were raiding the Schoharie and Mohawk valleys in 1780. And the marker was put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution. It's very significant, that South Chuctanunda gets developed early on for mills, grist mills, sawmills, and the like. But basically, it's going to be the North Chuctanunda that's going to be the powerhouse in the area because it has a 300-foot, it drops 300 feet in the last mile. So what it does is it has a tremendous amount of water pressure. It's a much better, more powerful stream to build on than the South Chuctanunda. And the reason why the first mills are here instead of on the North Chuctanunda in the colonial period is because the Indians wouldn't let us use the land. So we can go down this way by the armory. As I mentioned earlier, this was originally called Warren's Bush. It was all owned by a British admiral who brings his nephew over here, William Johnson, who later becomes Sir William Johnson when he goes into business for himself. when William Johnson goes across the river, he has to go to where Old Port Johnson is. Actually, he goes to where the train station is in Amsterdam now first, and then goes to Old Port Johnson. He does that because he can't move to the north, to Chuctanunda, because as part of a big land deal called the Catarosaurus patent, the royal governor has given this land away, and the Mohawks, who are generally pretty friendly to the English, say, no, you cheated us. So what happens with the Catarosaurus patent is the Indians have been cheated. They think they're signing away about a couple of farms worth of land, and it basically ends up somebody adds zeros to the deed, and it ends up being everything from Schenectady, well, from Albany, Schenectady to Saratoga to down to here. So the reason Amsterdam doesn't develop at first is because the Indians say, we love you, but let's be honest, if you live here, we can't guarantee you won't get scalped. So that's why you get development in Cranesville, you get development at Fort Johnson, but nothing where Amsterdam is until after now Sir William Johnson finally sorts the whole mess out. They come to a new arrangement with the Mohawks, and the Mohawks kind of lift their claim around 1763. So let's take a look at the Great Jewett Mansion here. We don't have to get out necessarily unless... you want to get out or you want to just keep going? Well, I want to talk about the Great Jewett for a minute anyway. Yeah. The only thing you can't see from here, you see the carriage house, or garage, which also has a turntable in it.
Does?
Mm-hmm. The other structure, which is on the other side of the house, small yellow clapboard kind of construction, is the ice house. And it's actually boarded on both sides of the wall, and the walls are filled with sawdust.
Yeah.
And that's where you keep your ice in the summer. Sometimes this is called the Churchill House. Very often it's called the Great Jewett Mansion. It is very typical of what I was telling you about before about people on the south side getting land rich, making their money off of property values. Gray originally made his money as a railroad engineer, but then he comes here and he marries into the Jewett family, which is a landholding family, and each generation there's only a girl that survives, so the next surviving girl marries into the Churchill family. And if you go to Green Hill Cemetery, you'll see they're all buried under the same large marker. It's a Jewett, Gray, Churchill. It's right at the top of the Sanford Stairs by City Hall. This was built in 1890. It is on land that they own quite a good deal of this land and the land behind us. In fact, up this hill was their farm. They originally owned where the armory was and then sold it to a man named Freemeyer, who built a house up here. It's reflective of we're really well established and wealthy now, having sold off some of our land and gone into business here and there. All the bricks for this come from the Grimm brickyards, which were up back in the direction where we came from, near Mount Carmel. And Grimm actually designed it. He was an immigrant from Germany, so he was one of the first school-trained architects in the area. And bricks from the Grimm brickyard were basically used in all of the Sanford mills and quite a lot of other prominent important buildings in the city of Amsterdam, like Lynch School and City Hall. They had a special method of firing the bricks up. They had a reputation for being highly durable. The building's also interesting because it not only because of the different kind of textures, the wood, the detail, the combination of brick and stone, but it is a sort of transition between what was called a Queen Anne, which is a Victorian style, and a Colonial Revival style. It's Colonial Revival is much more formal. Victorian, a lot less formal. A lot of people think the most interesting thing about Victorian and most significant is that it's very elaborate with lots of scroll work and all that. But it isn't really. The most interesting thing about Victorians is they're kind of designed from the inside out. See, with these later styles like Colonial Revival and the like, you basically you've got a box, you've got a shape, you've got to make everything fit into that stylistically acceptable shape. With the Victorian, you tell your architect, or very often it was a carpenter, would actually just show you a book and you'd say, yeah, I want that, I want this, give me a window like that, and they pull up these kind of style books. You basically design it from the inside out. You say, I want a room here, I want a room there, I want something over here, and whatever the outside comes to be, it comes to be. As opposed to the earlier and later styles. Like if you're talking a Greek revival, it better look this way, you know, rectangular with a side door with a pediment, and otherwise it doesn't look right. But in Victorian, it's like, this is a big, everybody always thinks Victorians are like very, very uptight and prim and proper. But this is probably the first time in American history where a lot of Puritanism and other conventions are kind of lifting. And so what you see is people getting a little, you know, having fun with their houses. If you go up to Green Hill Cemetery, the most elaborate and largest monuments you'll find are from the Victorian period. It's a time of great expression. It's funny, we always think of them as being like, you know, uptight. But they were very expressive. They loved color. It's one of the things people always ask me, you know, I have a Victorian home, you know, shouldn't I paint it white? And I was like, no, they didn't paint them white. They painted them pink, they painted them lime green, they painted them purple, whatever they felt like.
Usually 3 different colors.
Yeah, very much so. All right, well, let's go up and we'll take a ride around and talk about the armory and...
Is this the carriage house that belongs?
Later, I'm sure Susan will take you and let you go look out of the roof. You get a good idea of why it was built here and why it was the castle. I used to argue with art historians all the time. They say it was designed to intimidate the immigrants, workers, you know, with the power of the state. No, it's designed to be defensible. When you're defending against a mob with small arms or pitchforks or whatever, there hasn't been really much design improvement since the medieval period. It's designed so that National Guardsmen and state militia in a civil unrest situation could get together and have the time to get on their equipment, get on their uniforms, and mass enough strength that if they had to, they could rush out those big doors out front. And it's built to be defensible. And if you think about it, the people who designed it remembered the draft riots of the Civil War. They remembered the big industrial tumults of the Pullman strike of 1877 and all that. So when this is built in the 1890s, they have all that in mind. And it's not just a question of cheap land, because at that point, you could have probably gotten this land almost as cheaply up on Market Hill if you went up high enough. What the advantage is here is that it's close to the canal. It's close to the South Shore, the West Shore Railroad. It's close to the bridge. It's probably closer to the New York Central Rail tracks on the other side. It's probably even closer across the bridge to the New York tracks than it would have been if you were further back up on the other high ground. So that's why it's here. That's why it looks like a castle. It's a uniquely American style of architecture. In fact, it starts in New York. We invented it and spread out to the country. Basically, you only see it from about the 1870s to the 1830s. 1930s. Before and after that, they tended to look like commercial buildings, but to this period, they look like castles. And it also was a great pork barrel project of the day. You are really doing your job as an assemblyman or state senator if you could bring this contract home. Okay, let's go up.
Erected 1850, repaired and enlarged 1884.
The cost at that time was a little over $2,900. That's what they did. And as you know, if anybody around here, you know, the reason you were in buses today is that there's very little parking around here. This was a community church and people walked to it. And then in 1926, they built the addition on it. And they modified it so these 2 doors here are actually roll up. The one of them is open now so you can see it, the one's closed, and those are the same. You know, so as the congregation expanded or you needed more space. And then also up in the back, you can see those little squares up on top there. Those open up. There's one that's opened a little bit. You can just see where it's open a little there. There's a room up there for people who feel like walking up the steps and going up and take a look up there. And then there's really adventurous people. There is a, if you keep walking up the bell tower up there, you can go up and stick your head in there, see the bell if you'd like to. But then we'll ring it for you. A couple of years ago, I was working with a congregation here. I am another pastor, John McGee. And the congregation had gotten to a point where they felt that their energies and the resources were not enough to maintain and continue. So we're looking for alternatives. And a contract has been made for the sale of the property. However, we're still working on that, and the details are still being worked out. One of the things that changes of it is that the style of worship of the Spanish congregation that is buying it is such that they had no use for a pipe organ. It was pipe organ, one of an old tractor pipe organ in there. And that is being taken out. That's what you see here. What they're planning on doing is having a baptismal font up here, and then a picture of the hands, sit like the hands of God, and some lights on it there. So this will be modified for their worship. At the present time, they're worshiping here and also out in the room next door. The room next door was, I said, added in 26, and that's used for Sunday school purposes and presentations on that. Any questions?
Who owns the church?
The classes of the Reformed Church of America, the classes of Schohair, owns the church.
So they sell it.
They're the ones that are in the process of being selling it.
So anybody can buy it.
Well, we have a contract right now, but we're working out the details, and so I'm not free to say too much about that.
Where is the tractor going?
A person, I think in the Oneonta area, is one that is taking it apart. He's an organ individual. I don't know his name. And I think that would be available if somebody would want it.